In the previous video, we set up a Vue instance with a person string in its data object and saw how the framework reactively updated the DOM as its value was changed. In today's video, we're going to look at how to do more advanced DOM manipulations using Vue directives. These are special HTML attributes with a v- prefix, such as v-if and v-else, which display an element conditionally, and v-for, which is used to iteratively construct elements based on an array, and v-model, which sets up a two-way data binding between some form input and the application data. As always, these are best shown by example. What I'd like to do in this video is create a Vue app that reactively updates a list of your favorite food from a given array in the data object. First, I'm going to add a div element with the ID app, then create a Vue instance that mounts it, I'm going to add a dishes property to the data object and initially set its value as an empty array. Next, I'm going to draft two bits of HTML, a message to display when the array is empty and a list to display when it has contents. Obviously, I don't want both of these to be displayed at the same time. So what I'm going to do is exploit the v-if and v-else directives to ensure that the elements are only rendered in certain conditions. In particular, I only want the message to be displayed if the length of the dishes array is equal to 0. Otherwise, I want the list to be displayed. On refreshing the page, you can see that only the message is displayed, as expected. And once I add a few elements to the array, you'll see that the list element that I created earlier now appears instead. At the moment, the list just has some placeholder text in it, but if we check the Vue dev tools, we can see that the data is really in the instance, and we can access it using the mustache syntax as usual. Instead of accessing the elements manually, I'm going to take advantage of Vue's v-for directive, which allows us to render a sequence of elements based on the contents of an array. Here, we require a special syntax of the form dish in dishes, where dishes is the array and dish refers to the element of a particular iteration. Confusingly, in Vue, we use the keyword in, but it behaves similarly to of in plain JavaScript. Even more confusingly, Vue allows you to use the keyword of here as well, and it behaves in exactly the same way. On refreshing the page, you can see that the list now renders. If we add another element to the dishes array using the dev tools, you can see that Vue reacts and automatically updates the DOM. Super convenient. Now, what I'd like to do is add a form with which a user can add a dish to the dishes array. As you can imagine, I will need to be able to access whatever the user types into this input element. In Vue, instead of manually searching for this element in the DOM, I can set up what's called a two-way data binding between the contents of the element and some property in the data object. I'm going to call this property newDish, and initially it will be an empty string. Then I'm going to use Vue's special v-model directive to establish a two-way binding between the contents of the input element and newDish. We can see this in action using the Vue dev tools. When I type something into the box, you can see that the data model is automatically updated with its contents. Using mustache syntax, we can also reactively render whatever the contents of newDish is. Rather than just reactively displaying the contents, I'm going to display a different message depending on whether the string is empty or not. Lovely! Right, our final task is to implement some event handling, ensuring that when the button is clicked or when the enter key is pressed, this new dish is added to the dishes array. To achieve this, we're going to use Vue's VON directive, which allows us to add event listeners. I'm going to listen for clicks on the button, triggering a function called addDish when such an event occurs. And I'm going to use this syntax, keydown.enter, to listen for the user whacking that enter key, upon which we will call the same function. As in the last video, this function needs to be defined in a methods object of the Vue instance. I'm going to add a dummy definition of this function initially that simply alerts the user to the value of new dish. Now that we can see the function is being called, let's add a proper definition. First, I'm going to push the value of new dish to the end of the dishes array. Next, I'll alert the user. And finally, I'm going to reset the value of new dish to the empty string, which also gives the appearance of resetting the form. Job done. The final thing I'd like to show you is a shorthand for VON, and it's simply the @ symbol. And that's it for this mini video. We introduced some Vue directives for conditional rendering, such as vIf and vElse. We introduced the v_for directive for list rendering, the vModel directive for two-way data binding, in particular for form inputs. And finally, we looked at the VON directive for listening to DOM events, such as clicks or pressing the enter key. See you next time.